So once you've got a thesis statement, you still aren't ready to write your essay. You need to have a structure. And I do want to emphasize that it's very important that we have a structure for our essay. Nobody, students or AP readers, likes to read an endless block of text. I always tell my students that you want to have paragraphs and a progression through your paper. I often think of paragraph indentions as little handholds where I'm climbing up the wall of your essay and I'm able to get to the top. If you don't leave me any handholds, it just feels like, well, just blathering, and nobody particularly wants to read it. So we need to come up with a structure. But the sad truth is that unfortunately there is no magic formula for an essay structure that works with every AP poetry prompt. There are some general structure suggestions that can work depending on the poem being analyzed. So I'm going to show you 3 different ways that you might want to approach a poem, and some of them work better with some poems than others. Some of them work with some students better than others because that's just the way their brain works. So let's look at what I call 3 basic ways of approaching the structural challenge of writing an essay on a poem. And I will go ahead and tell you that I'm very biased toward this first one and the third one. Now, the first one is the one I always default to, because in my opinion, a poem is a chronological experience. You know, it begins in line 1 and it moves down toward the end and it takes us somewhere. And so a lot of times my motto for writing a poetry analysis, and it's a little dangerous because it can lead toward paraphrase, is to take the reader's hand and guide them through the poem chronologically and point out all the cool things about the poem as I'm walking through the poem. You have to be careful though not to just paraphrase the poem and not to just restate what happens. But I do think that it gives your essay a sense of power to move through how the poem affects a person when they're reading it. The way to avoid paraphrase, of course, is by analysis, to constantly be pointing out as a tour guide, look at that diction, look at that imagery, look at that incredible use of personification here. Something like that where you just sort of like show off the poem. So generally, sometimes I call this type of linear chronological approach to a poem form matches function. However the poem is built, I'm going to build my essay to match that. Now, luckily with sonnets, a lot of times they're divided into 2. There's sort of tone 1, shift, and then tone 2, so it might be easier for a sonnet, but most poems have a shift in there somewhere. So you generally just make your essay match section 1. This is where the poet's setting the scene. Section 2, this is where the poet has something happen. Section 3, this is where the poem meditates on what happened. Whatever the poem actually does, every poem moves differently. They're all different animals. But I want to emphasize that in each section, I'm going to talk about the poetic devices that are used and what tones are present there, all building up to the conclusion, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, section 2 is for more the analytical mind. I don't find it as effective, but generally, I call it the aspect by aspect approach, where you isolate a poetic device, diction or imagery or figurative language or use of metaphor or rhyme, and you write a whole paragraph about that. Now this can be challenging because the diction of the poem, remember there's a shift, so there might be a word at the top of the poem and a word at the bottom of the poem that are contrasting in some ways. But the virtue of this structure is that it forces you to do analysis. But I do find that it's a little mechanical, a little robotic, a little like throwing a poem in a sausage grinder and sort of like just grinding it out. So I don't always find it effective at conveying what reading the poem actually feels like. And sometimes I think the complexity can be a little difficult here, but it does give students comfort sometimes to divide up the poem into those different aspects. Now the third one I often call the dark path. It's a risky path, but I think it can work off sometimes. I call it the 2 tones or the 2 tensions poem. Generally, like we talked about with complexity of a poem, there's usually 2 things going on in a poem at least. And you might just isolate your essay into a half and half essay. Intro, then tension or tone 1, then tension or tone 2. You might have a shift paragraph in there if that's real effective, and then a conclusion. This can be kind of a simple approach to a poem, and maybe too simple sometimes, but I do think it can be as effective as well. And notice this probably moves chronologically through the poem too, similar to style 1 over here. Generally, though, my best advice for writing about a poem is 1, be structured, and 2, make your format match the poem in some ways. So when it comes to writing the conclusion, I mean, sometimes I think the intro needs to be nothing but the thesis, but writing the conclusion can be challenging for students because they feel like they're just repeating yourself. I tell my students to generally end with the end. Whatever the last word or image or tone of the poem is, try to mimic that ending in your conclusion. I mean, it's not unusual for when I'm talking about or writing about a poem to say the poem ends with, and I sort of leave the reader with the fade to black of, what's the last thing you see in the poem. When you write a conclusion that ends with the end, it gives a sense of finality to your essay and shows how the artistic experience ends as well. It mimics it in a way that I think shows that you have caught the tones and meaning of the poem. So I wish I could give you, more specific advice about structuring your essay, but be structured and model your structure after the poem. It sort of makes it exciting. You never know what your essay is going to look like until you've read and analyzed your poem.